Hi guys, welcome back to another episode of Leaving the Jar podcast. I'm Monica and I'm here with John.
Hi everyone.
And our guest for today is Bella, and I'm just going to have her introduce herself right off the bat. Hi Bella, how are you?
Good, thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here.
Yeah. So my name's Bella Yusuf. I am currently a LPC, licensed professional counselor, and CMNCS certified, sorry, just got the certification, certified mental health and nutrition clinical specialist, combining mental health and nutrition. And my experience working with anti-trafficking is I used to be a director of survivor services at an anti-trafficking agency for some years.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah.
Okay. So let's just jump right in, right? Can you tell us a little bit about some of the stories that you've experienced?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it may help to give some context to kind of what kind of work I was doing. When I was working at the anti-trafficking agency, I was a case manager. My title was Director of Survivor Services, but basically I was working face-to-face every day with adult, domestic, and foreign national survivors of trafficking. Now that could be sex trafficking, could be labor trafficking as well. We didn't do minors because we really wanted to be able to just give the financial resources that were needed without all the red tape and the foster care system and things getting involved. And our team wasn't equipped for that at the time. So I worked primarily with adults, both foreign national and domestic. It was challenging work. A lot of times, very, very different experience in terms of what a foreign national, all the obstacles they have to come across, as well as very different obstacles that a domestic survivor faces. So I don't know which kind of story you guys they're very different. So is there one in particular that?
Honestly, can you give us both?
Sure.
I'd love to hear both.
Yeah, sure. So I've worked with survivors and I will try to generalize because I never want survivors to feel like that I've worked with called out but I've worked with survivors that really didn't see it coming, right? Most of them were adult women when we talk about domestic survivors, so American born or lived in the US for a very, very long time, that when they went through trafficking, they didn't know what was happening to them. So less than 2% of survivors know that what's happening to them is trafficking. I think the statistic now is like 1 to 2% self-identify. Oh, wow. It's very rare. So there's a lot of this is what kind of was happening to you.
Wait, Are you talking about just labeling it as trafficking, or do they understand that what's happening to them is wrong to begin with?
Yeah, exactly. So they often don't even know because it's oftentimes done in the context of a relationship. So for example, it could be a husband that's trafficking you. It could be a boyfriend or a very, very close friend that you trusted, and many, many times for minors, parents trafficking their kids. Wow. And this happens a lot in DC, a lot.
Parents.
Yes. It kind of becomes a culture, where there's kind of this double life that's happening, not just in DC, all over the country. But yeah, so it can be extremely complicated for them to just even figure out, what is this thing that's happening to me? For a child, it might be that they're going to school, and then they're coming home and there's certain things that they have to do to be part of the family, or that this is just kind of how we pay the bills, or these are just my mom or my dad's friends and this is how I serve the family, right? So you can imagine the extreme dichotomy that's happening inside someone as a child. Now, if we're talking about adults, it could be somebody that was in a loving relationship and it was very, very healthy for a long time. Sometimes we call that Romeo pimps, right? Where they are love bombing them. They're in a trusting, committed relationship. They may have kids together. Oftentimes they have kids together. And the lines start to blur slowly over time. It's one little favor and then it grows and then it grows and then it grows. And often,
Describe that.
Yeah.
In I know this is going to sound horrible that I'm asking for details in this kind of thing. But I feel like our audience, some of the folks that watch are in disbelief, right? So I want you to use even stronger terminology. Sure. When you say one little favor, what happens next? I want you to understand because we've had several folks come and talk to us about similar things, but I want this episode specifically to be very direct.
Yeah. It really could be anything because we're talking about human nature, right? So we're talking about millions of different examples of how that happens. But the trend that I've seen is that it does kind of grow over time when we're talking about love bombing, Romeo pimp kind of relationship. So that could look something like, hey, after a love bombing has gone on, right? And he or she has spent a ton of money and a ton of energy on the individual, maybe buying them new clothes, paying off their bills, helping sick family members, right? There's that bond there now, right? Like, of course I have to repay you anything you want, right? And they'll ask something like, could you go on a date with my friend? Just go with him to this thing, right? Or could you give this person a massage, right? Or, hey, like, can you have sex with them? It's just one time, it means nothing. A lot of confusion, sometimes shock happens, and they know, there's an entire book out called Pimpology. Like, there's trainings, like traffickers, they're master manipulators, and they will help one another to learn how to get better and better at manipulating, right? So they have a whole way of how they do things, a whole, proper passage of events that takes place before they really know that person is hooked. And so they really need to know that hook is in deep so that they're going to be able to get that person to start. Now, sometimes they continue that trend through coercion and blackmail. So, well, I filmed it, and if you don't keep doing this, guess what's going to happen? This happens a lot today, especially with children online. I would say online is the number one place for finding predators now. But that hook has to be in there. So might start with love bombing, then move to manipulation, coercion. It could turn into physical abuse. Every relationship is different, and it depends on the relationship between the individual and the trafficker. Is it a boyfriend, husband, wife, parent? What is the relationship? And that will kind of dictate what kinds of things are asked for them and how it's asked for them, depending on how much power that person has over them and how fearful that trafficker is of being caught or that person leaving or escaping, and how much of the law they're willing to break to keep that person under their control. So it starts with something very small, and then it starts to grow with either coercion, physical abuse, or continuing with that love bombing relationship of like, no, honey, but I really need this. Our family really needs this. Do we want our kids to eat? But again, we're talking about humans, so it could be a million different examples of how they get them to fall under their control. But I would say the number one thing when I worked with survivors that they dealt with was the psychological abuse. It was the constant. It was a lot of drugs. It was a lot of drugging them. And then making sure that law enforcement in the area and friends and family knew that the trafficking victim was the crazy one. So anything that they said was immediately discredited because, oh, she's bipolar, she's schizophrenic, or he's got a personality disorder, whatever it is, right? You can't trust them. Oh, they're on drugs. They'll say anything. They're an addict. Once you get that narrative going, especially I saw that narrative happen a lot, you've lost all credibility, right? And now you're at the mercy of your trafficker, because the law enforcement might be called 10, 12 times, but they've already labeled that house the crazy house. They've already labeled that man or woman somebody not really worth listening to. So what do? Right? Like, there's no way out.
So what do you do?
Like, what would I do in that kind of situation?
Like if I am a trafficked person and I've been labeled crazy and nobody's listening to me, what do you do?
The number one thing is to seek out help that, is meant for trafficking survivors. Because this story, the National Trafficking Hotline, they've heard this story a million times, and they have resources that they can send you to in your local area. And then there's also, groups that do recovery, right? And then there's federal law enforcement that is specialized in identifying this kind of thing and helping somebody get out. Unfortunately, a lot of local law enforcement is not trained in this. I will say, I think they're getting better and better, but a lot of times they don't know. They're just like, oh, this is a domestic violence thing. Oh, a marriage spat, a family problem, whatever it is. It's very messy. And oftentimes it is very messy. It's extremely convoluted and confusing and complex. We're talking about two humans where there might be children involved, right? So there might be child abuse happening. CPS might have been called on both sides at some point. Okay, well, how do you know who to believe? So the other thing that I want to add is that when people call the National Trafficking Hotline, I think a lot of people get nervous that it's law enforcement listening on the other end, but it's not. They do provide tips to federal law enforcement if that's going to help get somebody out of a situation, but everything is 100% confidential, and you can call anonymously too and just ask a hypothetical question and say, if this was my situation, what would happen? Are there resources around me? Or to even call pretending that you're helping somebody that's in a trafficking situation. So there's ways to make it less intimidating if there is a survivor that's wanting that help. But I really like the National Trafficking Hotline because they have a really solid list of all the resources, and they're regularly updating what is in the area that can help, whether that's recovery or stabilization, restoration, if somebody needs residential care. There's a lot of resources that I think that's a really good central place to start if somebody doesn't know what to do and they're in that situation. So I did want to add that in, that there's a lot of fear with survivors related to dealing with law enforcement, because a lot of law enforcement has even taken advantage of survivors. I think that's rare, but it does happen, unfortunately, too often, to not say that survivors should never have their guard up against law enforcement. I worked with one survivor that particularly said, like, law enforcement would come up kind of demanding or asking for having sexual demands. Otherwise, they were going to be put away.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. They were going to catch them on prostitution, but the reality was they were being trafficked. They weren't prostitutes. And in the federal definition of trafficking is an exchange of goods or money or shelter with force, fraud, or coercion involved as well. It takes some time for law enforcement to prove that. And I think that's why people can be very nervous to get involved, because there have been, trafficking cases that have gone sideways. And there have been law enforcement that have misused their power, really abused their power. But that's not to say that there aren't tons of well-trained, very good federal officers out there, especially Homeland Security investigations. I love HSI. I really adore them. I've also worked with FBI and the Victim Advocate Specialist VASs that are both with HSI and FBI. But yeah, I've had a lot of positive interactions with HSI. Yeah.
Honestly, I think that speaks a lot to how much awareness really needs to be put out on this topic, because not that anything they're doing is okay, but I'm sure a lot of the law enforcement officers are also just as unaware of how bad things can actually get. You've said a lot of things today that have kind of just taken me aback. One of the things you were talking about, like, traffickers have like a book to tell them like how to do things and what they can do. Yeah. And something that we've heard like a few times actually is, a lot of people who are trafficked tend to become traffickers themselves. Mm-hmm. I just wanted to ask you, to speak more on that. Yeah. Is it something you've seen before?
Yeah, I mean, when survivors were coming to me in the program that I was working with, we would hear stories of something like that, whether it happened to them. But remember that if you're in like a trap house, you're in a setting where there is multiple survivors of trafficking, it's not just you, which is out there, right? What people might in the old days describe as like a brothel or something like that. It doesn't look exactly like how people would imagine in their head, like, oh, a brothel, like what we saw in Taken. It's not exactly like that, but it can be. When that happens, it's survival of the fittest. So there are what we call bottoms. Bottoms are individuals that are being trafficked. Right now we're talking about sex trafficking specifically. Individuals are being sex trafficked that they're called bottoms, but really they kind of run the house and they keep other individuals in order, right? These are people that the trafficker kind of keeps as their like right-hand person, right? So like similar to when we saw slavery in the US, we saw a lot of African slaves, right, that were kind of running the show. Somebody that a slave master trusted to kind of run the show kind of thing. Does that person want to be in that position? No. Are they absolutely morally conflicted? Yes, 100%. Is it what's keeping them safe or keeping them fed or keeping them from being sexually humiliated or abused? Probably, right? So they use more coercion and force and fear and intimidation and sometimes physical violence to get that hierarchical order in place to make sure everything kind of stays in line. And so, yes, that person might have been with the trafficker the longest, or they're the most trusted person, or they've made the trafficker the most money, whatever it is that is the standard. And they're kind of trusted enough to kind of run the show because they've been around long enough, they know how it runs. And they also know if they were to step out of line, if they were not to fill this task, what would happen to them, right? And whatever that may be, depending on the tools that specific trafficker is using. So yes, 100% it does happen. I think it's just a survival game sometimes at that point. We don't ever look at those people as like worse than or anything like that. They just were doing what they needed to survive, but they're typically one of the most experienced in the group and know how everything is run, know how to keep that trafficker happy, know how to keep money coming in, how to keep people in line in whatever kind of forum that they're doing that trafficking.
Okay, this is it keeps getting darker and darker with some of these interviews that we're doing in this podcast. So I'm not really sure, but let me take a step back and walk us through what's the process that a trafficking survivor goes through when they'll call LTJ, and if they need help, like what kind of programs, what kind of things should they expect they're gonna get to experience in the healing journey after making that first phone call?
Yeah, it really depends on where they are in their journey. If we're talking about still needing recovery, then getting out, right, in the safest way possible, quickest way possible is really, really important. And then, of course, there may be a federal case as a result. Now, the federal case isn't the survivor versus the, trafficker. It's not like that person is taking the trafficker to court. It's the U.S. government that's saying, hey, you seriously broke some federal laws. We're going to try and put you away for a long time kind of thing. And that survivor is now a witness. Now, unfortunately, there are some court systems that are not super familiar in how to work with survivors. So these survivors are now being subpoenaed and required to come in and give their testimony of what happened, right? Now, some survivors just want to get out and have nothing to do with that again. They don't want to go on the stand. They don't want this to be publicized. They don't know who's taking pictures. Is there now a huge target on their back? Does this trafficker have other people that are going to come and get them? So usually when somebody gets out of the life, they are paranoid for good reason. I wouldn't even call it paranoid. I'd call it like hypervigilant of all of the risks that they've just exposed themselves to. And depending on how long they've been living in that setting, they're even more hypervigilant because that's all that they've known for maybe years or decades, I've even worked with some survivors that they were in the situation for months. Well, it still is going to take a long time before they can feel like their setting is safe again. So really it's a matter of identifying, the supporting agencies. What does this person need right now? Okay, so federal law enforcement is taking care of the legal side once they've gotten out. Some law enforcement will be very gentle and very careful about how they interview and how they get that information, and will want to make sure that that person is attending like trauma treatment therapy. But other people, they just need the information fresh quickly if they're going to get some evidence on this person. So we have to understand that they're coming into, they're very very fragile and feeling very broken. And now they're coming out and facing a million different questions about the trauma that they just went through. And potentially, if there is a romantic relationship, they're asking to turn their romantic partner in, right? Mm-hmm. Because there's that confusion, that dichotomy that's really going on inside of them. And remember, if that person has children with that person, oh my gosh, well now my kids won't have their parent, I won't have my partner and I won't have a parent. So that's a number one reason people will stay in it. But if they do get out of it, those complex things are still there. So most times what I've seen is survivors do not want to touch it. They don't want an investigation. They don't want to press charges. There are very few and extremely, extremely brave survivors that take time to heal and then are willing to go through that really wringing out that you go through with a lawyer and with the court system. So that's kind of like part one, is like, where are they? And were they just recovered? Have they been out for a while? Have they kind of been working for themselves? And now they're worried that they're going to get prostitution charges. Like, how did they kind of come into the system, so to speak, or into services? Step two is really just meeting their basic needs. So we talk about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So safety, right? What is it going to do to keep you safe so that you can actually sleep at night? A lot of my survivors really wanted to get dogs because then they at least would hear a barking while they're in the shower or something like that. Something's rustling around the door outside. At least they would be alerted, right? Kind of lock system or ring cameras or whatever it is that are needed for that person. So really establishing safety. Because if you don't feel safe, you don't want to eat, you don't want to sleep, you don't want to groom yourself, you don't want to do anything, right? So we need to make sure that they feel safe. So with my agency, that may have looked like what will it be? What will it take to keep you safe, kind of thing. And for some people, that means they need to go to a residential program, right? Similar like the one that LTJ is working to build. I really like the residential programs. It's one of the only programs that the US has everywhere that I would say 99% of the time it's totally free, right? It's specifically set up for survivors. They have specialists that are there just to work with that population, and everybody in the house is a survivor. So you're not mixing populations of people that are healing. It's not domestic violence. And so that's a really incredible tool. That's, I've had to work with a lot of survivors for them to get to the place of saying, hey, you're not giving up your autonomy. You're just going into a program where you can have those wraparound services, because it's one thing for me to try and provide for your safety and your food and your clothes and your kids and whatever it is while you're living on your own and dealing with the hustle and bustle of getting 1 or 2 jobs, right? Depending on their education level, paying all of their bills, dealing with all the stress and triggers that they're going to experience while also being nervous that they're going to run into somebody from their old life, right? That is a very different, challenging experience compared to going into a residential program where there's 24-hour surveillance and staff and the fridge is always full and you don't have to worry about anything. You don't have to work. You don't have to do anything until you're ready. So that would be, for me, step 2, working with a survivor, saying, do you need a higher level of care? I call it an HLOC. If you need an HLLC, then what are your worries about going into that kind of program? Well, going back into a house with a bunch of women that were also trafficked, that's hits way too close to home. I don't want to do that again. Oh, and there's all these rules I have to follow. How does that not feel like I'm just being trafficked all over again, right? So there's that psychological warfare that they're really struggling with. So I worked with lots of women and individuals that really needed that, and they just couldn't commit to that. They couldn't go into that kind of program. So that's step 2, is kind of figuring out, are we doing outpatient's not the right word, but like kind of different services kind of coming together, or are you going to a residential program? If you're going to a residential program, what part of the country is it going to? What's going to happen to your kids, right? What's your aftercare plan? So many questions that come up. That's kind of the basics of it. Sorry, I don't want to overwhelm.
No. It's good information.
Yeah,
it's very valuable information. You touched on this a little bit, but like you said, LTJ is in the process right now of building a safe house. What advice would you have for both LTJ and maybe any other residential programs that are taking in survivors of human trafficking? So what advice do you have for them?
Yeah. Like new programs that have been doing this for a while? Okay. I would say it's really, really about protecting your staff, because when you hire the right staff and you protect their peace, you protect their minds, you protect their hearts, you protect their wallets, right? When you really take care of them, they're way less likely to get burnout and leave. And that's the number one thing we see with residential programs is people just, I can't do this anymore. It's too much, right? So it's about making sure that those people have mental health services. It's about making sure that there is adequate staff to, I can get sick and it's okay. I can go on vacation and it's okay. There's gonna be somebody there. I don't have to guilt myself into coming in. And built in mental health days too, of being like, hey, you haven't had a mental health day in a few weeks, in a month. Why don't you take one today? We can call so-and-so and they're kind of fresh and new. So it's really about taking care of, honoring your staff, and having really good leadership. I have seen so many outpatient, inpatient programs struggle massively based on the leadership that's going. Because when you have bad leadership, you have bad morale, and that always impacts the survivors. So really, if you start strong, you're going to have a trickle-down effect that's going to really honor the survivors you're bringing in, because there's a very different experience of somebody walking to a house full of people that are refreshed and joyful and prayed up, right? And really about the care of the person that's in front of them, rather than being like, I'm so tired, I got to get home and take care of my own kids, and like, why am I here again? And I'm probably going to get sick soon. Those are 2 very different experiences. Compassion fatigue too. People are hearing horrid things that have happened to children or adults constantly. They need to be processing that out regularly. There is no option to not be going to therapy if you're being exposed to those kinds of stories. So that's kind of like the residential staffing piece for me. And volunteers, massively important. Anybody that is interested in volunteering should get background checked in every single way possible. And you know, there needs to be a whole person that's coordinating. Where can we plug in all these volunteers so that way we're keeping on budget and we're not burning out our staff? That's really massive. For the individual, the survivors piece, right? That's about making sure that we follow Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Do they feel absolutely safe? Are they getting their basic needs met? For me, it's a big part of like, what nutrient deficiencies are there that are going to cause all of these different fears, behaviors, phobias, whatever. So making sure that you're rebuilding that. Because remember, when they were in that situation, most of the time they're not eating well. They're not hydrated. They're not taking vitamin supplements, right? That's not happening, right? So you're coming in with somebody that has a gut microbiome that's completely messed up, right? Which we call the second brain. So we know that that's massively affecting them. They're extremely nutrient deficient. There's probably a ton of toxins they're dealing with. There's a lot of spiritual oppression they're walking through. Like the whole person needs healing. So it's really about being like, okay, let's take this slow. Let's get you just starting to eat something different than microwave meals. Let's try chicken. Let's try some different stuff, right? And kind of educating them to be self-sufficient. Survivors don't want to completely depend on everyone around them. So you're gently taking them step by step. Whether it's a child or an adult, it'll look different. But giving them autonomy and teaching them how to care for themselves with grooming, with life skills, with community building, breaking off toxic relationships, with eating, with drinking water, with supplements, with everything, with how they dress, everything. They walked out of a culture that is completely foreign to us, right? They were living in that culture. That was their world. In fact, a lot of survivors will call it square world when they leave that and they come into our world. They call it square world because like we're like a bunch of squares. We all fall into place and compartmentalize perfectly. We all go to like our 8 to 5 jobs or whatever it is. And that is a lot. They didn't have to worry about taxes before. They didn't have to worry about their car getting towed if it's not registered for a long time. They didn't have to worry about different payments that come out of nowhere and you know, making sure that they register for Medicaid or Medicare. They don't have to think about any of that. That's like, you know, somebody that's like 15 or 16 and being like, hey, why don't you come out into the real world and deal with all the problems of an adult, right? Now, I'm not labeling survivors as if they're 15-year-olds, but rather that's the level of experience that they have in terms of the world. They're aware of it, they've heard of it, they've had some exposure to it, but it's not something they've often had to deal with. So how do you honor that person and not belittle them and show them how to, you know, use the ropes of the world properly and slowly in a way that's not too much while they're healing from the massive amounts of trauma that they went through? It's very complex. And that's why I say like your staff and your leadership, if that's not on point, it's going to fail. And if Jesus isn't in the home, I don't see it working nearly as well. There are tons of secular homes that, you know, do fine, but I've seen the best run homes are ones that Jesus is the core and center of the home. I really believe that when you invite Holy Spirit in, he can do healing far beyond and immeasurably more than anything we could ever think to ask for. Really, like I really believe that. And I've seen that pretty consistently. And then also making sure that you're not pushing that on a survivor. Oh, you have to love Jesus in order to be in our program. Hey, you have to pray in order for you to stay here. We're not putting demands on them that are similar to what they just went through, where they had to follow certain rules in order to receive love. We're just saying, hey, this is the culture of what we're bringing into you. We're bringing you into a holistic, a very different life than where you were at before, and it's up to you to choose that for yourself or not. So it's a lot.
Yeah.
And residential is different than like an outpatient thing.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you, Bella.
Sure.
This is a ton. And I think this is one of those episodes that you're probably going to have to watch several times to kind of really comprehend and digest everything Bella just told us. Whether you are somebody who's looking to open up a residential facility because God has put it on your heart, or whether you are a traffic victim that has now made the decision to leave that life and step out and reach out to some of the different resources Bella's been talking to us about. Replay some parts of these videos and listen to it closely and take the next step. And I think God will definitely honor your efforts.
Bella briefly mentioned volunteers as well, and as some of you may know, LTJ is really just built upon volunteers, and so we will also have information down below in case you would like to volunteer to be a part of LTJ and start helping human trafficking victims yourself.
Thank you guys for watching this episode with us, and thank you, Bella, for coming.
Thank you guys for having me. This was awesome.
All right, we'll see you next time with another episode of LTJ.